Dr. Rachel Bezner Kerr, who is an associate professor in development sociology at Cornell University. And for the past 17 years, Dr. Bezner Kerr has worked with soils, food, and health communities, with the Soils, Food, and Health Communities Organization in Malawi. And she will be leading this session that we are preparing for, entitled Farmer-Led Research on Agroecology and Nutrition in Malawi and Tanzania. Looking forward to hearing from her. Would you please welcome with me Dr. Bezner Kerr.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here. I actually bumped into ECHO a long time ago when I was an undergraduate undergraduate student, and so it seems really nice to actually come here. I've never been here before, and it's been a really interesting session so far, and I'm really grateful to Kathy because she set up a lot of the nutritional dimensions, which will help put some of the work that I'm talking about into context. So you'll see on the screen I have a photograph that I took a number of years ago, and it's a happy family smiling. Their names are Mercy and Zaire, and they're holding their little baby. You'll notice the woman is kind of gesturing. She's making a sign like this. She's pointing back to her. And you don't know, is she talking about the crops behind her, which that's their field, or is she talking about something else going on in this picture? And I've put this as my opening photograph because I think to some extent it encapsulates some of the three different methodologies that we've used in Malawi and that we're trying out in Tanzania to try to improve food security, sustainable land management, and nutrition. So Malawi, as some of you will know, is in southern Africa. It's a landlocked country. It is a place where there's high levels of food insecurity. There's also high levels of poverty. The average income is around $400 per person per year. And the majority of people are smallholder farmers who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods and for a bulk of their food source. And both men and women work in the field. That's why you see this photograph here. Men and women are very active in farming. It's also a place where there's high levels of stunting, and we just had an overview of what that means for child nutrition. It's hovered it was close to 50% for about 20 years. It's dropped to a little higher than 40% of children under 5 who are stunted, so very high rates of stunting. But there's another aspect to Malawi that's interesting for what we're talking about here. It's a maize-based system. Maize corn makes up the majority of landscapes and makes up the majority of people's diets, a lot of monotonous diets. So thank you, Kathy, because we now know that that is very problematic from a nutritional standpoint. And it's a place where industrial models of agriculture, the use of fertilizer, the use of hybrid seeds have been very actively promoted, both by the colonial government, the British, and in the post-colonial context under a man called Kumuzu Banda, who's this man here. He was a dictator in power for 30 years in Malawi and very much promoted smallholders to use fertilizer and to use modern agriculture, which was monocropped maize with fertilizer. At the same time, this began under colonialism. A little bit of history. In Malawi, you had, as a smallholder farmer, to sell to the state entity. You didn't have a choice. You had to sell to that state entity, both under colonialism and post-colonial, under dictatorship. And that crop was sold by the government on the international market, and the surplus was taken and funneled into this other lovely crop here you might recognize, which is tobacco. And the tobacco production was done by large estates under colonialism, white British farmers. Post-colonial Malawi, a lot of that land went to the allies of Kumuzu Banda. And so it was a dual system that channeled a lot of the work of smallholder farmers to the benefit of largest stakeholders. And agricultural research also tended to focus on these export crops. Post-Banda, so we've had democracy in Malawi since 1994, but still it's a very unequal place where the wages on estates are very low, very bad working conditions. And so these are some of the factors that have led to high rates of poverty and food insecurity and malnutrition. It didn't just come about naturally. There was some political and economic and social factors that structure the current realities for smallholder farmers. But in addition to these broader social forces, there's also degraded land inherently because it's older soils. These are older tropical soils, so they're low in nitrogen to begin with. So if you combine that with a cropping system that promotes just applying fertilizer and not adding organic matter, you have a problem on your hand. In addition to these broader factors, we have at the household level very significant gender inequality. So women have fewer access to resources, they have less control within the household in terms of decision making regarding farming, and they have lower access to education, lower employment opportunities, and there are gender norms that make violence against women considered acceptable. Malawi is not unique in this regard. We've seen here in the United States some recent events that really highlight this issue of gender inequality. So this isn't unique to Malawi. This is not only a Malawi problem, but this is a problem for women and men in Malawi. And this has implications for farming. It has implications for nutrition, and I'll come back to why I think that's the case. So an alternative approach to addressing agriculture, which I've been interested in testing for a number of years, is an agroecological approach, which is a holistic approach to agriculture which tries to replicate natural systems. So cycling nutrients within the system, recycling organic matter back into the system, maximizing energy and water conservation, minimizing use of toxic inputs, and really drawing on farmer knowledge and farmer experimentation as a means to grow food. And so this approach varies by place, obviously, because it's adapted to the local ecosystem, but also the local cultural and social needs. So back in the 1990s, I'll age myself, I was doing research as a master's student, and I met a community nurse at a local hospital, and at the time, the fertilizer subsidies, which had been in place for many years, had been pulled back because of structural adjustment in Malawi, and so fertilizer prices had skyrocketed. And the hospital was teeming with severely malnourished kids. And the nurse and I decided we wanted to do interviews with families to understand what were some of the factors leading to people admitting their kids for severe malnutrition. And we heard a number of stories. One of the stories we heard is that farmers didn't know about alternatives to commercial fertilizer. They had been told for many decades to use commercial fertilizer, and they weren't aware of alternatives to improving their soil fertility. So they felt like they couldn't do anything to get decent maize yields in light of the fertilizer subsidy being removed. So there was this loss of knowledge piece around soil fertility. Declining soil fertility is a big issue, low maize yields, and dependence on maize as their primary food crop. So that was part of the story that we heard. But we also heard from women that if the household was able to gain some income from the sale of their crops, their husbands were taking the money, selling it, taking the money and using it for alcohol use. So there was a problem with alcoholism. And we also heard stories of domestic violence when women tried to contest the use of this money for that means. So this was a lethal combination that was leading to kids being severely malnourished. And we became really intrigued and compelled by this story and decided to start a small pilot project that we called the Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities Project, based out of the hospital initially in 7 villages. And we wanted them to test different alternatives to commercial fertilizer. We were able to draw on research that had been done by the Ministry of Agriculture and by ICRSAT that had different legume intercrops as options. And this is one of the options here, pigeon pea, which is a shrub, semi-perennial, some of you will know it. It produces a pea that's edible. It can be used as a forage. It can be used for fuel wood. It can grow for a number of years, and it has deep roots that pulls up phosphorus from deep below the surface. And then groundnut, which we heard about earlier, which provides a lot of oil. It is harvested earlier in the season, so it doesn't compete with pigeon pea. This combination was one option. Pigeon pea and soybean was another option. And intercropping just pigeon pea and maize was another option. There were a range of options. It was a basket of options. The idea, the model that we took was farmer participatory research. So we asked the communities whether they wanted to try these options, and they test them on their own farms. So farmer-led experimentation was one of the cornerstones of our work. And our thinking was, in terms of agroecology, we don't know what's going to fit best in their local growing conditions, under their labor conditions, so they should try it out and see what works. And so we asked the communities to identify men and women in their communities who could be members of a farmer research team who could get additional training and capacity building on these methods and provide support to other participating farmers on these methods. And we worked initially with just about 180 farmers in these 7 villages. And things were going along. We tracked over time. So I'm a researcher. We measured child growth. We measured food security. We measured the productivity. And we also did participatory annual workshops with farmers to learn what were they finding out. And that's part of this participatory action research model, where we're doing action with farmers, where they're doing their own experimentation, and then reflection to see what they think and what's happening. And we learned some interesting things. One of the things we learned was, yes, we were getting uptake of these legumes, and people were growing more legumes. And so we thought, great, we're having success. But what we heard in the workshops was from women, well, first of all, my husband's still taking the crops and selling them and using them for alcohol. So we weren't doing a nutrition promotion program. We were doing an alcohol promotion program. So we had some work to do. We also learned, in order for these legume intercrops, based on the research that had been done previously, in order for them to improve maize yields the following year, because it's a rotational system, a rotational intercrop system, they needed to bury the legume residue to get the biggest bang for their buck. And they needed to bury that legume residue right after harvest. So as soon as you're done harvesting the legumes, you should bury the crop residue so that it can decompose and you're not losing it to volatilization. But typically women in this area, in this region, are the ones responsible for harvesting legumes. And so we were asking for a change. This was the big change, actually. They grew the groundnuts before. They grew pigeon pea before. The 2 big changes were the pattern, the doubled up legume intercrop, and burying that crop residue after harvest. But we are essentially asking them to add an additional task to their already long list of tasks during the harvest period, or go back home to hubby and say, honey, I just finished harvesting the groundnuts. Do you mind just going over to that field and burying in the crop residue? Well, that wasn't happening, because that involves difficult, complex gender negotiations, and I've just mentioned that there's dramatic gender inequality in Malawi. So that wasn't happening on a large scale. We had very low crop residue burial for the first few years. So what the farmer research team decided to do, after reflecting on these results and this discussion, they identified 4 key themes that they were going to focus on for the next couple of years. I'm not talking about all of them. One of them was exclusive breastfeeding. That was a priority that we needed to do some work on. There was some intergenerational conflicts that we needed to have discussions about. Another was frequency of feeding of young children, and you heard about how significant that is for addressing child nutrition. A third one was dietary diversity. So again, these are all themes that we weren't making progress on in the communities. And then the last one was what they called, politely, family cooperation. I really loved that term. So family cooperation was about these difficult gender dynamics in the home. And one of the things the farmer research team did is they went village to village at the time when the crop residue should be buried, and we had demonstration plots in the villages, and they said, hey men, we are about to bury our crop residue, which is fertilizer, by the way. So you are the big strong man that you are. This is a job for you, because men do heavy work in this community. That it's a cultural notion that men do heavier work than women, even though if you If you're in the fields, you might think that women are doing plenty of heavy work. But anyways, that was what they called men to do. Come and bury this crop residue with us. Come see what we're doing. This is a job that you should be taking on because this is your fertilizer for next growing season. So they basically did a campaign, a big political campaign throughout the villages. And what we saw and what we've continued to see with this strategy, which was developed by the farmers in the communities, was a significant change in crop residue burial. Which was very exciting for us. And we were able to see improvements in maize yield using this approach, compared not only to nothing, but also compared to just maize with fertilizer. We had a significant improvement in maize yields, which is very important if you're trying to address overall food security. And we did this. I got addicted to this work, so they kept doing analysis and research and working with this community, and we were able to show a significant improvement, not only in terms of maize yield, so this is a fancy graph that someone else came up with, and this is the no difference in maize yield compared to using fertilizer, so just having the same effect, but you get other benefits. If you have access to fertilizer, your soils can use them more efficiently because they can better hold the nutrients because you've improved soil health. You have more soil cover for a longer period of the year, so you're reducing soil erosion because pigeon pea is a longer duration legume and it's very bushy, so it covers the soil for a longer period of the year. You have a potential improved diet because you have more protein yield as a result of having these legumes. And this is not VCR, the old machine, that's value cost ratio. Your cost goes down in part because you're not having to purchase as much, if any, fertilizer with this system. So this is very exciting results for us. But I talked about some of these difficult dynamics around negotiating at the household level around labor. There were also issues around exclusive breastfeeding, which requires that women take the time to do breastfeeding, and that they get sort of special attention during that time period. Frequency of feeding of young children also requires that time, that attention to young kids. And so we devised these small group discussion groups where they had small groups of only young men with children under the age of 5, only young women, older men only who don't have young kids, and older women, so grandmothers and grandfathers, that's what we called them. That's what they were, in fact. And they had discussions that were facilitated by community members who had training in participatory facilitation techniques, and they talked, we called them agriculture and nutrition discussion groups. So these were discussion groups where we integrated both agriculture and nutritional issues, and in every discussion. And then they would discuss different issues, and then they would meet as a large group and bring up things that had come up in the small group, and sort of, so you had a safe space to raise difficult issues like, I'm really having a problem with my mother-in-law saying I shouldn't be exclusive breastfeeding right now, I should be introducing watery porridge, and then you bring that up in the large group, but not like Sally over here said that, but you know, in our group this issue was raised. And so we found that that was quite effective, and we were able to show, and not all of you will know that the longer the bar, in this case, the worse the child's weight for age. That's WAZ here. And so we were able to show significant improvements in child growth, both height and weight, for families who were participating in both the legume diversification activity and this participatory education activity. And so that was really exciting for us. But it took time, I should say. This is after 7 years of doing this work. And I should also say that we expanded from an initial 7 villages to many thousands of farmers that we were working with over time, because there was a lot of interest in this work. So we then started a new project where we incorporated a few other dimensions. One is climate change adaptation, and this was partly in light of what we were learning in the international arena around climate change and what was anticipated for a place like Malawi. And the other was agroecological approaches more broadly, not just focused on legume diversification. And we wanted to understand what farmers' perceptions were of climate change. So we had initial research and dialogue with farmers about climate change. And we learned that they do perceive very significant changes in the rainfall where they noticed that the rains are coming later and leaving sooner, and that there are more often breaks in the middle. And there were rains that used to come during the dry season that had a different name, and those no longer come. But they didn't attribute it to any sort of global processes. They attributed it to local deforestation. So there was a sort of lack of knowledge of this international scientific discussion around these causes, but they did see very significant changes in the rains. And so we worked with 20 villages. In each of those villages, we asked the village to select 20 members who were either severely food insecure and or had someone in the household who was HIV positive. So 2 groups that were highly vulnerable to climate change. And we asked those households if they were interested in participating, and if they were, we did some initial training on agroecological methods and sort of the principles of agroecology, and then had sort of a blank slate. What would you like to do experiments on? And they did agroecological experiments for 3 years, ranging from agroforestry, crop diversification, integration of small livestock, small livelihood activities like honey production and making fuel-efficient wood stoves, and using these intercrop systems that we had worked with previously. And one of the things we learned is that there were some crops that used to be grown in the area that had disappeared from the landscape. So sorghum, for example, it's an indigenous, more drought-tolerant grain in Malawi. It had completely disappeared. People had forgotten or had lost that knowledge about growing this crop. So that was one of the crops that we worked with. Finger millet used to be much more common and had also declined significantly. So it wasn't lost, but it declined significantly. So farmers were interested in doing experiments with some of those crops. And over a 3-year period, we saw a significant increase in crop diversity. This was one of the key, very simple, but significant activities that farmers took up. And they saw this as a really important way to mitigate their risk, so that they had a range of different crops to turn to should the rains be too heavy or too light in a given year. And we measured food security using something called the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, which is a standardized set of 9 questions. And we found a significant shift from the majority of households being severely food insecure to being either food secure or being moderately or mildly food insecure over a 3-year period, which to us was very exciting because we had really had this very open-ended project. We also saw a significant improvement in household dietary diversity. One of the other things we noted was communities started to organize more broadly. They were meeting monthly to share their experiences. Some of the community members who weren't official participants became interested because they began to feel quite hopeful that if these highly food insecure and AIDS-affected households are able to do these experiments, then maybe I should be trying some of these things. This community here in this photograph had done a lot of work on finger millet, and they were so pleased with the results that they decided they were going to share seeds and knowledge with 10 neighboring villages. So they approached 10 different villages and distributed seed to those 10 neighboring villages. We did some We did some multivariate analysis to look at what were some of the determinants of the changes in food security and dietary diversity. And for us, what was very exciting, and I didn't mention that we incorporated the same methodologies around attention to gender inequality and nutrition education that we had done in our previous work. So some of those same participatory education activities we also did in this project. And what we found was that crop diversity, so the number of crops cultivated, and discussing farming with a spouse were significant predictors of food security and dietary diversity. To us, this was really interesting. One of the things we learned when we started this project, we asked, who do you discuss farming with? Anyone have a guess as to what percentage of people said their spouse? Any guesses? 5%. Oh, you're more pessimistic than I am. It was 10% of people. So this is a rural community that does farming for its livelihood, and you're not discussing farming with your spouse. And we found that there were these kind of separate worlds where women were talking to their friends and to family members, and men were talking to their friends, and they were talking to the extension workers, and they were talking to village leaders, but they weren't talking to each other. And so to us, this was very exciting that simply increasing that knowledge flow and that access to information between spouses was a significant predictor of household food security and dietary diversity. And so I come back to this picture, and this is one of our experimenting farmers, and she's pointing not only to the crop of maize behind her, which she grew after she did a legume intercrop, but she's pointing to her husband, who is holding the baby, which is a pretty radical thing in some circles. And she more or less said this, not an exact quote, but you know, you can admire what I've got back here, and my husband is holding the baby, so he's getting more involved in childcare and feeding, and that's a pretty radical shift for them and has significant implications. So we then began a new project where we really wanted to scale out our work and see whether we could do this at a larger scale. We'd been working with around 400 households at a time in a given year, and we wanted to see if we could work at a larger scale. So we began 5 years ago something called the Malawi Farmer-to-Farmer Agroecology Project, where we are working with 6,000 farming households, 3,000 in the north and 3,000 in central Malawi, using these same approaches of some initial training on agroecology principles, also on nutrition and on gender and social equity, and then doing farmer-to-farmer training. That was a big piece of our approach with this work, because this is still a small organization that's at the forefront of doing the training. And we increased our attention to gender in this project. We incorporated a number of different ways to raise gender issues in this project. One of them you see in the upper right is what they called a gender campaign, where youth developed different songs and dances and went from village to village in this truck singing songs and dances, and the songs were old traditional songs that had been adapted using new lyrics. We also had recipe days where we would cook different recipes to show different ways you can use the foods they were growing, but men would very actively take part in doing the cooking as sort of a public demonstration of new ways that men can get involved in childcare and in cooking and housework. And maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal, but we did some research on men's reactions to this and found that there was that just having this kind of public event where village leaders and well-respected members of the community were doing cooking was quite radical in a place where it really wasn't acceptable, and social norms did not normally allow for men to be involved in cooking. And we also had field days where we would not only have demonstrations of what people were doing in the field, but have theater and other ways that we brought up some of these difficult issues. And we were able to show a significant improvement in child dietary diversity, not as much as we want. So I wasn't able to put the slide in because we're currently analyzing our results from 2016. We still have a long way to go with addressing child dietary diversity. It's kind of a hard nut to crack. But we were able to show significant improvements in household food security. And we have found that social inequalities are really key for whether farmers can utilize these agroecological methods to improve their food security and their nutrition. So whether it's social inequality at the household level, which I've talked mostly about, but also at the village level. So for example, in some villages, there is pigeon pea growing, and the village headman decides, you know what, this looks like really good food for my goats and cattle. And he lets his goats and cattle range in people's fields, and so they lose all their fertilizer for the following year. Or a poor household who's migrated from the south has some land and improves it with these different strategies, and then the village headman says, that land looks pretty good. I'm gonna take that land and you can go over here next year. Thank you very much. So social inequalities at the household and community level are barriers for people to use these methods. But there's also some broader social forces that are at work that can prevent them from being effective, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So one of the things we've been doing the last 2 years is trying to formalize our teaching approach, and we've created a curriculum that integrates agroecology, climate change, nutrition, and gender and social equity into one document. Sounds easy, right? It's actually really difficult, and we've tried to make it farmer-led, so hands-on activities, written in accessible language. We've tried to make it accessible for people with less than secondary school education, which is the majority in places like Malawi. And we field tested it and this is all done with Malawian colleagues and now with Tanzanian colleagues as well. And we field tested it in Malawi and in Tanzania. And so we're in the midst of writing that up. So it's available in Swahili, Chitumbuka, and Chichewa. But it's full of flaws, but it has some gems to it, and we're analyzing the results of our field testing experience. And thank you. And in the last 3 years, we've started, I was invited by some colleagues who work in Tanzania to see if we could start a sister project in Tanzania with a similar approach. So along with colleagues at Northwestern University, at Nelson Mandela African Institute for Science and Technology in Tanzania, and ActionAid Tanzania, we initiated a Singida Nutrition and Agroecology project, which uses a very similar approach of training farming households in agroecology and gender and nutrition issues, and then offering them a range of options. In this case, we've really focused on legume diversification again to see if they can see improvements in nutrition, in food security, and in sustainable land management. And Tanzania is similar in many respects to Malawi in that there's high levels of food insecurity, high levels of child malnutrition, high levels of gender inequality. Of course, many differences, many cultural differences, and so it's not all the same, but some of those things are the same. And the area we're working in is quite a bit drier than where we work in Malawi. And after 1 year of this intervention that we started, because we began the sort of educational component last year, we've seen a significant increase in crop diversity with people growing more legumes than they had previously. And we're also seeing a significant increase in people adding manure to their soil as a means to improve soil fertility, so that's exciting. You see that the baseline, 60% of people said they did nothing to improve their soil fertility, so we've got lots of opportunity for improvement there. We looked at how women and men use their time, so we've tried to increase our sort of assessment of the gender dynamics at work in rural households. And you can see from this picture that men have a lot more leisure time than women. They're both sleeping the same amount of time, but there's a lot of time when women are doing a lot more work. And we used a method called photo voice to really explore this in more depth, particularly during the dry season when the agricultural work is done, there's really significant differences in leisure time. And we also measured depression with this study, and we found very significant rates of depression. Over 60% of women, through using a standardized set of questions that's been approved by the Center for Epidemiology here in the United States, that 60% have major signs of depression. And we did some multivariate analysis and found that depression is closely tied to household food security. Not surprisingly, I would be depressed as well if I was food insecure, but also gender inequality. And so this has given us some further thinking about the different dimensions to work on with regards to gender inequality. But even after 1 year, we've seen some mild but significant changes in the division of labor, with men helping more with some of the household tasks like carrying the manure to the field, always a fun job, and caring for children. So we're excited about this, but these are early days with this project. I should say that the kind of linkages between this project and Malawi, we had the farmer research team in Tanzania travel to Malawi and have a week of training from Malawian colleagues. The Malawian colleagues came to Tanzania to implement the training in collaboration with the Tanzanian organizations we're working with, and they also visited it a second time to see how things are going. So we're really trying to support this work across this region. But there are broader social and political forces that work against this approach. As many of you know, the emphasis in the international community is really around industrial approaches to agriculture. And that's where the research money is, that's where the development money is. This photograph of this monocropped groundnut field is right next to some of the participating communities that we work in, where land has been taken and by private investors who are from outside the country, and they're growing groundnuts for export. They've fenced off the area, they have very few workers, and that has implications for the availability of land for smallholder farmers. The government signed an agreement called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. This is the former president, Joyce Banda, talking to Bill Gates, who's one of the proponents of this agreement, which commits the government to freeing up 200,000 hectares of land for international foreign agricultural investment. So that has implications for smallholder farmers as well. And Monsanto is an active player in Malawi, as are the other big seed companies like Pioneer and so on. And there's a draft seed legislation in Malawi, and there's a seed law in Tanzania which bans farmers from sharing seeds. So that all has implications for the potential for this kind of approach to agriculture. In addition to the political concerns, there's concerns about climate change. Malawi and Tanzania are anticipated to experience greater drought, a greater frequency of drought, greater severity of drought, greater inconsistency of rainfall patterns, as well as heavier flooding when rainfall does occur. So that all doesn't bode well for the future unless we get our act together here in the West. There's a whole other piece around trying to get viable livelihoods from these crops that people are growing, and that's a real challenge with the urban areas increasingly westernizing their diets and buying from supermarkets and no longer being interested in buying from local farms. And so getting viable livelihoods is an ongoing challenge, something we're working on, but it's not something that we've had much success with so far. So just in conclusion, what we found over this long-term research is that agroecology can be used to improve food security when combined with this participatory approach to doing research and attention to social inequalities at different scales. And we found that crop diversity is one of the key strategies that can really make a difference. Legume diversity in particular is a really powerful tool. But we really have found that this flexible, iterative approach to doing research, to doing participatory research, where there's opportunity for reflection and dialogue and for stepping back and seeing where we're making progress and where we're not making progress, and sort of integrating the research with the development activities has been a really key approach. And then we use dialogue as a key strategy for trying to get at these difficult social inequality issues. And we've also used theater. So we try to be creative in thinking about the ways in which to tackle these more challenging, conflict-ridden, tense issues around inequality. But really to sustain these kinds of food transitions and to maintain these achievements, we as an international community really need to tackle some of these more difficult issues at a broader scale. Climate change, the kind of strategies that are being pushed in Africa around industrial agriculture, farmers' rights to seed, and so on, if we want to maintain these successes. So with that, I look forward to your questions and comments. All right.